Okay, well, I'd like to introduce the speaker this morning. Marcia Cantarella has been an associate dean at Hunter College, a dean at Princeton University, and part of the dean's staff at NYU's College of Arts and Science. In these functions, she has been responsible for academic advisement, career development, preparation for postgraduate fellowships, development of diversity programs, preparation for postgraduate fellowships, development of diversity programs. I'm sorry, I'm repeating myself. Strategies to generally enhance students' academic experience and outcomes. She has drawn on 15 years of corporate experience gained as Director of Public Affairs and then in marketing at Avon Products to apply these skills and backgrounds to communication challenges, financial and strategic planning in higher education. As Vice President of Student Affairs at Metropolitan College of New York, she was responsible for web development and rebranding of the college, as well as admissions and student services. She is the author of I Can Finish College, the Overcome of Any Obstacle and Get Your Degree Guide, which educators, parents, and students say is a gold mine of information and strategies, especially for first-generation, low-income, and students of color who struggle to complete degrees. Dr. Cantarella frequently provides workshops for college-bound students for programs including Futures and Options, Prep for Prep, and Eagle Academy. She was author of the Student Handbook and Facilitator's Guide for the PBS documentary All the Difference, produced by Wes Moore, as well as materials for Ken Burns' documentary College Behind Bars. She is co-director of Hunter College's Black Male Initiative and has been a consultant with the National Urban Coalition for Effective Education. She is co-chair of the Steering Committee for Degrees NYC. She serves on the boards of Reed Alliance and St. Elizabeth University and serves on many other advisory boards, including Create Change Transformation Foundation and Boy Scout Council of Manhattan. Dr. Cantarella graduated with honors from Bryn Mawr College and has master's and doctoral degrees from New York University in American Studies with a focus on American business. She is the daughter of the civil rights leader, Whitney Young. Welcome, Dr. Cantarella. So please unmute yourself.
Okay. Elaine, thank you. And the connection there in my bio is Bryn Mawr. So Bryn Mawr has been a great connector in my life. And I'm delighted to be here, be back with you. I was with you a few years ago, but also kind of on a spiritual level. I'm Unitarian. Normally at this hour, I would be at Fourth U in Manhattan, although we're on Zoom. But from a theological, I guess, standpoint, philosophical standpoint, we are certainly kindred. My church is actually just a few blocks from the Ethical Culture Society in Manhattan. So Elaine asked me to talk about how college is different now. There are, a few ways that it's significantly different than what, you all may remember your own higher education experience being. It's certainly more expensive. It's more socioeconomically and ethnically diverse. It is more female dominated, women outpacing men in degrees earned. And it's much more career centered. So I'm going to use what was until recently the College of St. Elizabeth and just became St. Elizabeth University this summer at the Convent Station. So some of you may know it. I'm going to use that as my model because it really kind of reflects, although in a small campus universe, the trends that I just cited. So St. E was originally much like what Elaine and I remember Bryn Mawr being. Very white, very affluent, liberal arts with an unstated goal of marriage, earning your MRS. And so when we got there in the 60s and 70s, people like Elaine and I became the change agents, bringing diversity, activism, and feminism to our campuses. And, you know, certainly in the 60s, we were involved with the civil rights movement. We were involved with the emerging women's movement. We were involved with the anti-war movement. What the campus looked like when I stepped on that Bryn Mawr campus in 1964 and what it looked like when I left in 68 were really different animals. St. Elizabeth's has experienced some similar changes, although far more dramatic. So, you know, it has become co-ed, whereas Bryn Mawr certainly hasn't. So I'm going to do a little historical background for you. As the workplace changed, especially post-World War II, you know, work tasks became more managerial, except on the factory floor, which actually became more automated. College degrees became the ticket to the middle class, to managerial jobs. And public colleges like CUNY were often free. CUNY was free until the 70s. When it was time to pay for college, those with homes used them because they purchased them using the GI Bill, which, you know, to a large extent also excluded people of color, but used those homes as a way of financing college. And on the other hand, if you were Black or brown, you'd been closed out of the housing market and access to quality education, the two going hand in hand. The quality of your local public school depended on your tax base. And so if you were in a low income community, then, you know, you weren't receiving that, you're not going to receive that benefit. It's not a was, it's an is, right? That's the current reality. It has been for a long time. Catholic schools were often familiar to immigrant populations and may not have had the price tag of other private schools. So immigrant populations often looking for a quality education would gravitate towards a Catholic school. If you were a woman, starting in the 60s, what had been all male campuses opened up to you. So, you know, Harvard, Yale, Princeton, the Ivies all opened up and became co-ed. Princeton has been teetering back and forth between being 50% or more than 50% female for some time now. So a school like St. Elizabeth lost its traditional affluent white women students and gained more immigrant students of color. But in order to grow, and this happened fairly recently, it needed to add men, because women having the opportunities to go other places, and certainly affluent women, were gravitating somewhere else. So the men also coming to St. E tended to be students of color. And yet, because of the centuries of discrimination, these students have had less money to pay for education and yet more need for it to advance. Now, you know, the women's movement until now, and there have been some COVID impacts pushing women's advancement backwards, whether women will be able to work at the same level because they're juggling, you know, being at home and childcare and all of that right now. Whether that's going to be a setback for some period of time post-COVID, we don't know. But there have been generally significant achievement by women, both academically and in the workplace, but not so much for men and women of color. So now St. E is mainly low income and co-ed, and students of color, all of whom these low income students of color are seeking a way to get out of where they came from. And both Catholic and public institutions are dealing with this reality. These are students who, unlike my privileged grandkids, and my grandkids will be the 5th generation in our family to go to college. My grandkids are not in schools where college attendance isn't expected, quite to the contrary. My granddaughters had college pennants in their classrooms in 2nd grade, right? 2nd grade classroom with Harvard, Yale, Princeton on the walls. By 4th grade, they knew what the PhD attached to my name meant. That's privilege. That's not the norm. So structural poverty also has cognitive impacts on children from birth. Maybe having a mother who's malnourished, and she and the family continue to be deprived of nutritious food. We've heard about the lead paint issue. We've heard about the bad water issue. I mean, all of these things have cognitive impacts. While my youngest granddaughter, who's about to turn 3, had a library before she was born, and a significant library before she was born. She was also just picking up books herself, at 15 months. She'd just grab a book and go off and page through it at 15 months. On the other hand, children in 1st grade who are taking part in the Read Alliance program, where I'm on the board, never owned a book until we gave them one. And this is in kindergarten. The way Read Alliance works is that we pay teenagers from the community minimum wage to tutor children K through 3rd grade to bring up their reading skills. And so books are given as rewards for achievement. But these kids have never had a book. So in addition to that, inner city schools are underfunded and get the least capable teachers. And never enough teachers of color because there aren't enough. However, we seem to be survivors, notwithstanding the socioeconomic cycle of deprivation that has tried to keep us from progressing. And despite the aptitude that can be manifested in a documentary like Ken Burns' College Behind Bars. So if you haven't seen this 4-part documentary series, it tells the story of the Bard Prison Project. And the project reveals the ability of inmates, mainly people of color, who when offered the chance to engage in rigorous, Bard standards, higher education, surpass all expectations. They even beat the Harvard debate team. So the assumptions that led to these inmates winding up in prison, some of them the result of educational deficits at an early age and family issues and functions of poverty that have been tossed by society. And there's a whole huge history of, the prison pipeline greatly impacting communities of color. The assumption is if you're in jail, you're a dummy. Well, these guys have proven that that's not the case. So, there's a lot of waste of human capital. Similarly, the colleges which serve this growing, diverse, and economically deprived population are under-resourced themselves. And so their tuitions, while not at Ivy levels, are still a real stretch for the students who need them most. The ticket price for a residential student at St. Elizabeth is $45,000. Now, virtually nobody pays that. Nobody pays the ticket price, but between federal and state funds and scholarships, that's reduced substantially, but it's not zero. And it has to be, given the median household for Black families that is only $40,000 a year, median household for Black household income for Black families and 50,000 for Hispanic families. So we have students both at St. Elizabeth and at Hunter who have been homeless. All these students have to work at least part-time on or off campus and all summer to pay the bills, which even after discounts are daunting. Default is highest for this population. The federal data show that 17% of students who started college in 2004 and 28% of those who took on student loans had defaulted by 2016. Among Black borrowers, 28.7% defaulted compared to 21.4% of white non-Hispanic borrowers. About 35% of Hispanic borrowers have defaulted on student loans. Half of the gap between Black and white borrowers disappears from 28 to 14% when controlling for borrower characteristics, such as parent educational levels and home ownership, like my kids, right? Who will be paying, at the same level as your affluent white kid. Middle-class families will be able to do what we did when my kids were in college. We did the second mortgage, right? We just borrowed on the house. And my kids are going to do the same thing, are doing the same thing. But due to decades-long discriminatory practices like redlining, there are far fewer Black and Hispanic families who own homes or even have savings. So in 1967, African-American median household income was 55% that of whites. In 2016, it was 61%. Meanwhile, housing ownership declined for Black families. It got worse despite laws against housing discrimination. Realtors colluding with sellers can keep whoever they want out for whatever trumped up reason, and that pun is intended. It's subtle, but you can do it. You can get away with it. So these students usually work on or off campus to pay for their education, which doesn't leave a lot of time for hijinks, let alone clubs, leadership roles, sports, unpaid internships, or other resume building activities. But they do them somehow. And this is where grit counts. So what are the implications for each of these realities and what do they look like? These students get their degrees and then what? Well, the workplace remains deeply segregated once you leave entry-level positions. So white men are 61% of executives nationally and 81% above parity when compared with their 33.8% representation among non-managerial professionals. So those who move from the non-managerial ranks are disproportionately white. So if the talent at the non-managerial level is 33%, then the remaining 66% of non-managerial roles are held by people of color. And few of them move up to the managerial ranks. So Black men and women still represent a very low percentage of the professional white collar workforce, less than 8%. Given their representation in the total population, there's a significant disparity. And that helps explain the disparity in household wealth, therefore the capacity to pay for education. So what's being done and what needs to be done? And I'm going to focus on the what needs to be done in terms of what you may be able to do yourselves. So you can advocate for employment equity where you work or where your kids work. become part of the bearers of messages of change. I think it could be important to read books like Ben Crump's new Open Season, The Legalized Genocide of Colored People. It really is a historical look at all of the ways that communities of color have been demonized, have been deprived, and using the legal system. And so I think it's an important sort of background piece to framing whatever you want to engage in. But in terms of what you can do practically here and now, a college like St. E is looking for internships for students in corporate or any other viable and upwardly mobile workplaces. So it can be corporate, it can be not-for-profit, but really focusing on opening the doors and creating opportunities for young people of color to have workplace experience, ideally paid workplace experience, because Lord knows they need the money to pay for their educations. They need mentors. They need somebody to help them navigate college. There are programs that help with that, but they need people to help them understand the workplace culture, understand the norms. That does not mean challenging them on how they wear their hair. That's not anybody's business, and it's really annoying. But it means helping them understand how to get ahead. We're talking about students who've been homeless, so they haven't necessarily eaten at a white tablecloth restaurant. Of course, none of us has recently, but when we get back there, never been to a play, basically don't have the privileges that you take for granted. There's students living on campus during COVID, and they are behaving themselves because it is a safe space for them, right? It's safer than the communities that they come from. They need mental health counselors who can help them see that they are not inherently failures. There's nothing wrong with them. It's the world that's failed them. They need money for scholarships or to enhance educational facilities like upgrading technology. During COVID, one of the things that's become very clear is the technological disparity. Who has access to the internet? Who has computers? Who even has a space of their own, right, where they can study or work? Because if the campus is closed, then the library is closed. You're working in whatever space you have. We've seen it with Read Alliance because we've converted to an online platform. And so the tutoring is taking place on Zoom. And so you get to see kind of what's happening in the background of both the child and the tutor. And it's not quiet. Now, these schools, like many campuses, and I do mean many campuses, St. E has a food pantry where students can pick up free food. Food insecurity is real. When we were meeting on campus, when the board of St. Elizabeth was meeting on campus, we board members would bring bags of food for the food pantry. There's also a documentary on that, the name of which I'm not remembering, but it's a very profound documentary on food insecurity on college campuses. So these schools also serving this first-gen low-income population need programs like the CUNY Black Male Initiative that I've been part of since its inception nearly 14 years ago. BMI creates what our students have called a safe space to be smart, where they can engage intellectually, have a community of support, and reach high. We've had students tell us over the years that dressing as they dress for college is not necessarily how they dress when they head back home into their neighborhoods. So the college itself, and certainly programs like BMI, allow for a safe space for them to really manifest what they're capable of and be encouraged. We've actually had good attendance during this COVID period while we've been on Zoom, because the need for community remains. And the stories of too many failures of our system relative to young men of color are told beautifully in another new book, Ann Kim, called Abandoned: America's Lost Youth and the Crisis of Disconnection. And it talks about, you know, all of the ways in which, you know, young men, in particular, young men of color, are just dropped out of the system. If they're homeless, and we've seen homeless students at St. E., there is no connection to what we think of as the resources and the connections and you know, what we take for granted. You know, they are adrift. They're just adrift. So these narratives can be changed, and I'm gonna read through a list of what change has looked like for our students at Hunter. So Chris Blackwood, who earned his master's in chemistry at Hunter, earned his PhD from Cornell University in pharmacology, and he's now at NIH and teaching at American University. Nahum Traore spent 2 years with the MIT Poverty Lab after he left Hunter, and ultimately earned his doctorate in economics from the University of Wisconsin. He's now at the World Bank. Kwabena Dankor, PhD, had a fellowship at Princeton after Hunter, earned his doctorate at Berkeley, and is now teaching the faculty of the Stanford Business School. Aaron Doler earned his doctorate from the University of California in San Francisco in pharmaceutical sciences and pharmacogenomics. Don't ask me what that is. He's now a consultant at Putnam Associates in Silicon Valley, focusing on science projects. Stephen Odom took advantage of several internship programs while he was at Hunter, and is now at Deloitte. He's planning to earn an MBA. Chris Davis earned his degree and his PhD in history with a focus on Black history at Florida International University. And he has left there. He wanted to come north, but he will be teaching this spring at St. Elizabeth. Erwin Forbes is teaching at Uncommon Schools in New York. Jeff Shemale is teaching and coaching basketball, and he's about 9 feet tall, at Democracy Prep School while he's doing some real estate projects. Kyle Jeremiah is earning his master's from NYU at the Center for Global Studies while working as communications and community engagement manager for Energy Vision, where he started as an intern when he was an undergrad. Robert Ashemale is financial products and sales at Bloomberg. Kente Morgan, who was once a sanitation worker and a union rep, earned his JD from Cardozo, has been an attorney for Bronx Defenders and now Theatrical Teamsters. Rick Ixiano is earning his MD from the Geisinger School of Medicine in New Jersey. Stephen Hall, a product of our Hunter's Mark MBRS programs, is wrapping up his PhD in chemistry at Stony Brook. Don Raymond, PhD, was a Mellon Fellow at Hunter and is earned his doctorate in English from Rutgers, and he's on the faculty of the Whitney Young, named after my father, honors program at Kentucky State University, where my parents went to school, where they met. He also teaches for the Hunter Mellon program in the summer. So that's just a random sample of what is possible, right? But there are thousands upon thousands of students and young men and women, but young men in particular, who need all sorts of stuff. Need mentorship, need food, need money, need stuff, need connections, all the things that we just don't even think about, and is desperately important, including people who will advocate for equity in the workplace when they get there, or open the doors to them. So I will stop and I will take questions.
Okay, thank you very much. I'm going to, as we did with joys and concerns earlier, we're going to use the Zoom mechanism for raising hands and asking questions. So I have again pasted the same link into the chat window. So if you're not sure how to use Zoom for raising your hand, please take a look at that video. If you're using a telephone, you raise your hand on the telephone by pressing *9, and you can unmute and mute yourself by pressing *6. So I see the first question is Rachel Farrat. And I will ask folks that after you've asked your question, please put yourself back on mute. For now, Rachel, please unmute yourself and proceed.
Hi, thank you so much for coming back. I enjoyed your talk today, and I remember the last one. I enjoyed that very much as well. It seems that one of the problems at the sort of beginning of this, of these children's lives, is that there aren't enough teachers, there aren't enough teachers of color, there aren't enough quality teachers available. And I think a lot of that has to do with the way we look at teachers in our culture, and the way, and so what can we do to sort of raise the cultural esteem of teachers to make that a more popular destination career for smart and ambitious people who, you know, smart, creative, empathetic people who would make good teachers to give these kids a good foundation?
So, you know, I think we're in this era of media, right? Media being everywhere and pervasive. And so I think, especially for a younger generation, painting the image of teachers as heroic, which they are. There have been some films over the years which have done a good job of that. But I think, you know, telling those stories again, or bringing them forward again and making them more pervasive. I think people, you know, talking about their experiences as teachers and the extent to which they have been rewarding. We have to pay teachers. I mean, that's one of the, that's, you know, so any conversations about, you know, budgets for education, you know, when education tends to be a budget that is slashed, and it should be, you know, the last thing to go. You know, I mean, there's certainly sort of the whole national conversation about, you know, where our resources come from, and the, you know, the extent to which, you know, people who are affluent are not necessarily paying their fair share. And if we had more resources, then maybe we, you know, feel freer to put more where they need to go in terms of the investment in education as a higher priority. But I think, you know, advocating for that, as well as making it sexier.
David Bland, please unmute yourself and pose your question.
Yeah, thanks. I want to follow up on something you touched on about the role of public colleges in helping people get in, helping families make it into the middle class. So a few years ago, I read an article that was specifically on this topic, and I got very excited because they talked about two colleges, one of which was my school, California State University at Los Angeles, not to be confused with UCLA. They have, California has two separate university systems. And my school was mainly a commuter school. I commuted. And we had a lot of older students there. There was a dorm, but not many people dormed there. And we had, because it was in East Los Angeles, we had a lot of students of color, especially Hispanic students. And honestly, until I read that article a few years ago, I hadn't realized how important schools like that are as a driver for getting people to elevate themselves to another class and to into other types of jobs. And so I wonder if you could just talk some about that.
Yeah. As I say, I'm affiliated with CUNY. I'm a major CUNY fan. My late husband was on the board of CUNY. And they are absolutely essential. But they are also under-resourced. You know, one of the things that, you know, during this period, and an organization that I chair the steering committee for, called Degrees NYC, does advocacy on education at every level. Our objective is to increase the number of students who are proceeding through and graduating with college degrees, and to look at what the barriers are for that to happen. But, you know, major on our agenda is, you know, the extent to which we have to spend time in Albany. And, you know, making it popular for legislators to know that this is a critical investment, that, you know, starting with elementary school and working your way up, because, you know, the feeders to CUNY are the public schools. So, so it has to be systemic, that we enhance the, you know, the public schools, the public colleges. The money that's available from the state as well as the feds to help pay for education, because even though the public institutions are far less expensive, if you're living on between $30,000 and $40,000 a year, it's still a big chunk. And so, you know, how do we address that reality? So I think there's a lot of advocacy. You know, groups like Degrees NYC, who are advocates, and we include students in our governance, so that their voices are heard on these issues. It's very much about the politics.
Ruth Olson, please unmute yourself and pose your question.
Thank you very much for the talk. It was very interesting. But one thing that you said towards the end, you said that young men need this mentoring and this aid more than, well, you just said young men in particular, which leads me to believe, you know, young women don't need it as much. And I was wondering why. I know there are all sorts of theories that, you know, all young men don't mature as early as women. But are there other reasons why young men might need our help more than young women?
So, you know, you hit upon that first critical thing, which is, and, you know, guys, you may not like this, but the biology suggests that there is a 5-year difference in maturation for young men compared to young women. And if you stop and think about, you know, you send guys off to war on the assumption that they are going to feel more fearless, right? So it's, you know, the general statement has been that men mature by 25, whereas young women may mature by 21, you know, biologically. But the other thing, which is maybe even more important, is that, you know, the way we have socialized the image of males is the strong silent, right? And that men don't talk about what's going on with them. You know, you got to suck it up. And, you know, I'm fine. I'm cool. That whole culture causes guys to repress what may be going on with them. men don't go to doctors to the same degree or as quickly as men. And those of you who are wives know how often I've certainly done my share of nudging. I had to nudge my late husband to get a checkup or whatever. So even the idea of going for therapy is something that, and in particular communities, the more macho the culture is, the less likely somebody is to take advantage of the tools and the resources and feel like it is okay. So we have to make these things socially acceptable. We have to make it okay. We have to make it manly for our young men to feel that this is something important for them to do, for them to achieve what they want to achieve. And they also need mentors. They need other guys in their lives. Given the number of men of color who are shuttled into the prison system for no reason that makes any sense whatsoever, are there guys available in the community? Not necessarily. Are there success stories? Are there role models? They exist, but do they exist to the extent that, they are there, that they are accessible? So there's a lot.
Janet Glass, please unmute yourself and pose your question.
Hi, thank you very much. I'd like to underscore something you referred to before, was the Ken Burns documentary about the BARD project in prisons. I saw it. It's absolutely amazing. It's riveting. It shows these inmates how seriously they took the program, how the 100% percentage of those who were successful, and it's just so beautifully done by Ken Burns, and it's absolutely compelling as to what a terrific program it was. And then at the end, how heartbreaking it is, because, and not spoiler alert, the program was defunded. So it's something that should be seen by everyone, I think. Do you have any idea how we could get that shown? Because it does show how high achieving people could be under the worst circumstances.
Well, I think it's still available on PBS, and PBS unfortunately kind of cycles things through. It'll be there available for, a year or so, and then it's harder to access. But you do have to go to PBS to get access. Sometimes, and this may be one of them, if you are affiliated with an educational institution, you can also get access. But it is absolutely an amazing piece of work, and the stories of what the graduates of the program have gone on to do is fabulous. It's just it's like our BMI program. It's just one more example of when you intervene and you offer people the opportunities and you give them the support. Look what happens! Surprise.
Dan or Elaine, please unmute yourself and pose your question.
Thank you so much for a wonderful, informative talk, and some excellent suggestions for folks who are in the work world, how they can participate and help with this issue. I did want to say that the Biden-Harris platform would provide free community college to everyone, and then I believe for public colleges for families with income under about $120,000 a year. So that certainly would help, and let's hope that comes to fruition. I did want to ask a question about the role of liberal arts education in a time when higher education is very expensive, and a time when people are focusing more on practical skills. And any thoughts you might have on that?
Yeah, no, I'm really glad you asked that. So Google did a study of itself. They wanted to know where they're getting the most value in terms of their employees. And And so they were, you know, kind of looking at the students with liberal arts degrees and looking at the students with technology degrees, and the liberal arts degrees won because you can create a widget device tool thing and have that capacity, but do you know how to run a team? Do you know how to plan a marketing strategy? Do you know how to write a memo? Do you know, all of those pieces which come out of things that one might learn as an anthropology major, which is what Motorola actually did when it first rolled out the its first iPhone decades ago, and used an anthropologist to find out how to carry it globally. You know, I think what the part of the issue is that liberal arts have to help explain what it is. You know, we, as I'm an American Studies interdisciplinary historical person, that's my degree, but I also spent time in the corporate world, and I ran a marketing team before I did my PhD. With my political science degree from Bryn Mawr. So I think, you know, there's the need to help students find where you can excel, what's gonna tickle your fancy, as opposed to pigeonholing yourself into a discipline that you may not even like and therefore won't necessarily do well in. As opposed to finding yourself in a discipline where you can thrive because you care about it. Schools have, including faculty, have not necessarily tracked their alumni with that message. Princeton has. You can go to any, on the Career Services website, you can go to any major and click and see, not by name, but by job title, what the alumni who have graduated with that discipline are doing, right? And it's useful for the faculty to know, but it's really useful for the students to know. I can take this thing I love and I can do something useful with it. And I don't think we're carrying that message enough. At the same time, we have to treat technology as the same way we do teaching English. It's like a baseline. Everybody has to do it. Everybody has to know it. It's just, you know, it's one of the things that you do and you know and you have skills in. But then, you know, how else you tickle your brain to make it its best self should be an option. And you know, helping you know, as a Bryn Mawr grad, one of the things I make myself available to do, and assume you do too, Elaine, is talking to, you know, undergrads to let them know what, you know, what's possible.
Pam Berglund, please unmute yourself and pose your question.
Hi, thank you so much, Marcia. I loved your speech today. Everything that you spoke about really rang true with me. But one thing that you did bring up and brought up a lot for me was the fact that children don't have books. They don't see books until maybe they get into kindergarten, or, you know, they're not introduced to books until maybe too late. Is that what you're saying? And if so, why can't our community start working with children, especially in the pandemic, and helping children receive books, like donating books to the families, or, you know what I mean?
Yep.
And I don't want to see children not reading, because if I hadn't become such a reader, I would never have been so successful in my life. And there's no reason for children not to have a book. So what can we do as citizens to get the books out there?
So you can tell from my background, that's the tip of the iceberg in my, okay, so that's just a small portion of the books that are in this apartment. There are thousands. And so books have always been, you know, we are many generations of Winnie the Pooh fans in the family now. One of the school districts where two of my granddaughters are, and the third is now in nursery school. It's an affluent community. It's Hingham, Massachusetts, very affluent community. But they've done something that I don't think is, you know, limited to affluent communities, which is they set up a program where starting at age 2, a family can bring a child, a toddler, to the library, receive a plastic bag of maybe 3 books, take it home, have them read to them. When they bring them back, they get a gold star on a chart, and then they can take out another 3 books, right? By the time these kids enter kindergarten, they know their way around that library. And the goal is for them to have read several hundred books by the time they get to kindergarten, or have read to them. And if you're the reader, you know, I used to be able to recite when you give a mouse a cookie, because little kids do the read it again, do it again. That I can't imagine that the costs for doing something like that are extraordinary. And if books are donated from the community, and, you know, if you can do it through the school library, great. If you have to, you know, set up another system through, you know, through the Ethical Culture Society to do it as a project, whatever. You know, you can get books out there. You can get books out there.
Right. And I definitely would love to do it, you know, maybe through ethical. I had suggested one time doing a book program, where the kids would be reading, let's say, a certain amount of hours per day. And it was like a bookathon, but unfortunately it never went through. And the other thing that I just wanted to mention is I just read an article yesterday that says why Johnny can't read. And they did a study in North Carolina, and kids who would normally be reading in kindergarten are not reading as they should be on a level anymore. And some of them can't even read up to a 4th grade. In other words, they get to 4th grade and they can't read. And this is a scary thought.
Well, that's the reason that a program like, you know, as I said, I'm on the board of Read Alliance, and what Read Alliance does is have this dual impact model, where we start with kids in kindergarten who aren't reading, or certainly aren't reading to grade level. And we want them reading to grade level by 3rd grade, but we hire at minimum wage teenagers from the community to teach one-on-one, to do one-on-one tutoring with the kids, who the teachers have identified them as not reading at grade level. And so it's a carefully managed program. It is an expensive program, because we do insist on paying the teens minimum wage. So it is that dual impact. But we've also seen, you know, all of the teens end up heading off to college. Some of them are getting, building relationships with members of our associate board, who are young corporate executives, who are mentoring them. And we're getting corporate support as a result of that. So it's a total win-win model.
Right.
And, you know, I'd be happy to, you know, connect you with people, with the folks who, you know, run the program on a day-to-day basis.
Can you see seniors doing it?
Maybe. The thing with the teens is that they are coming from the same community, so that there is an identification with having had sort of a similar upbringing, similar experience, knowing the neighborhood, as it were, and that becomes empowering for the little kids. We've actually had examples of people who were little kids who got tutored, one of whom is actually now on staff. She's a director for research. She was a little kid who got tutored, and then she became a tutor, and then she went off to college, and then she came back, and now she works for us. You know, we love when that happens. So yeah, I think, you know, we can have anybody doing it, but it is powerful when there is that peer relationship.
Edna or Laszlo, please unmute yourself and pose your question.
Okay, yeah, I was going to bring up something very similar to what Pam just raised. I believe it was when we heard your last address to the society that I was also thinking about, that when children get those books at 5 years old, it's rather late. And I just mentioned it to someone else that I knew who was retired, and I said, why can't we also take books to the food pantries, which is one of the things that a friend of mine was doing on a very regular basis. And she just jumped right into it and started going to libraries and collecting whatever free books, children's books she could get her hands on, and started taking those to the food pantry. And eventually somebody built a little bookshelf, and eventually they added not only children's books, but adult books. And she says it's really a very successful and, you know, something that people are looking forward to when they go to the food pantry, not just getting food, but going, it's like a little library, but people can just take those books and keep them. So
I love that. And I'm sure that you and you know, a number of us who are grandparents know that, you know, as our grandkids are outgrowing the books, there is the question of, you know, what do we do with all these books that they are, you know, moving beyond, and that's a wonderful idea to take it to the food pantry if the food pantry is willing to manage that. I think that's great.
Ken, we can't hear you.
Just one more thing, that the PBS documentary is available on, the documentary on the prisons is available on PBS for streaming right now. I just checked it.
Oh, good, it's still on.
PBS,
good.
and it's available for streaming.
Great, I'm glad it's still up. Yeah, it only came out last November, so.
Ken Carr, please unmute yourself and ask Dan or Elaine to please ask a question.
Yeah, hi. So it's Dan this time. Actually, two questions. One, excuse me, one is really quick. You mentioned the documentary on food insecurity among college students. One of the rude things one can do when one is Zooming is look things up while other people are speaking. Was that called Hunger for Learning?
Yes, and it's excellent.
It, but it sounds like it should be worth seeing. But
yeah, it's very powerful.
My other question is much more substantive. So you've spoken a lot, and I think very, very powerfully about the importance of education for economic advancement and the importance of education for to develop one's ability to work in society. But I haven't heard much from you today about what I would argue is the other, and perhaps in some ways the more important purpose of education, which is to develop critical thinking. And if there's one thing that we can see in the world today, with the rise of illiberal authoritarian leaders, whether it's Trump or Orban or Duterte or Modi, or the list goes on, it's that there seems to be a real substitution in many people's minds, too many people's minds, of belief in authority for critical examination of the world. And if there's one thing that I think can help people develop a good sense of critical examination of the world, it's education. That's a key role of education. It's a somewhat subversive role of education, but I think it's essential. And I was wondering if you could address the ways in which, in the face of the gross unequal access to education that exists today, education can be developed to bring that kind, to enhance that kind of critical examination of the world, especially for people who don't have the intellectual capital in their families to start with.
So one of the things, and thank you, because that's absolutely true. One of the things that, and I'm not sure we can totally fix that with, I think there are some communities that are going to resist critical thinking. So, but we have found with within our Black Male Initiative program, for example, pre-COVID, we would meet every Wednesday for a couple of hours and always have a guest speaker. We're now doing the same thing on Zoom, but it's not, you know, that human connection piece in the same way, obviously. And we've saved a whole lot on our food budget, but on Zoom. But the people that we would invite as guest speakers and could be thought-provoking, and often were, or, you know, could be talking about, you know, how you advance in a career. But we could pick and choose people that we thought were going to engage the students intellectually and get their minds working on stuff. The students themselves would then often pick up, and one student along with one of his white Jewish friends, both of whom very liberal politically, challenged the political science department to have a debate, faculty student, right? And that came out of the empowerment that these guys felt as a result of the conversations that we had in our groups, right? I've seen students come out and start their own book club. Again, conversations started, you know, when they get together with us, and somebody would mention, yeah, I read this and you should read this. And then, you know, the next thing you know, there's a book club going on. There have been the CUNY-wide, because there is a Black Male Initiative on every CUNY campus. The CUNY-wide program just had its annual conference, and we have speakers coming from, you know, all sorts of places who are thought-provoking and engaging, and so we can get those conversations going as well. I think, you know, offering, and our students have characterized the program as a safe space to be smart. And so I think creating those environments where they can open up, they can engage intellectually, they can feel safe to express their point of view and their thinking, where we as the grown-ups can do connecting the dots in terms of the disciplinary relationship of what they're thinking or doing, or invite faculty into the conversation sometimes. We can nurture that. That can be nurtured. And we're not shying away from that. At least I'm not seeing anybody shying away from that on the CUNY campuses, for sure. And I think if it's true for CUNY, then it's probably, true in other places as well. I know it's also happening at Bryn Mawr. I think that's, that is part of the point of a college education. And I'll just tell one quick story that goes back to the 60s, when I was at Bryn Mawr. And what we were doing then was we were having teach-ins on the Vietnam War. And my father, who had the ear of President Johnson, did not make any pronouncements about the war as opposed to Martin Luther King, who had, because my dad was trying to push the war on poverty. He was helping build the war on poverty. So he didn't want to irritate Johnson, so he didn't say anything about the war. And he was also a veteran, so he went to Vietnam and he'd wear his military fatigues and he'd try to help the enlisted men feel better about being there. Meanwhile, I'm on campus and I'm going to teach-ins, right? And my classmates are protesting, and so I was at an event with my dad, and he was sitting on the dais next to McGeorge Bundy, who was the Undersecretary of State. And at the end of the event, my dad introduces me to McGeorge Bundy and proceeds to tell McGeorge Bundy, "This is the daughter whose views I was telling you about." Remember, Daddy didn't say it was his views. He said, "This is what she thought," and then leaves me to proceed to mouth off as a 20-year-old might do, with all I had learned in the teach-ins on campus. And it was evidently went well. 20 years later, Francesco and I were at a dinner with McGeorge, where McGeorge Bundy was present, and I told him this story, and he said, "And history proved you right." All of which is to say that, campuses, we know from the stuff we did in the 60s, we know the kinds of impacts that in-class or out-of-class learning and encouraged activism can have over a long period of time and in many different places. And we need to continue to develop that.
Gloria Smith, please unmute yourself and pose your question.
As a former Hunter graduate from a long, long time ago, I really feel, and Dan started to cover part of this, that the liberal arts for 2 years when I went to school, excuse me, was very essential in the education in my life. It developed not only critical thinking, individual thinking, and it has served very well for whatever I've done afterwards, even on the graduate level, and what I did in life. And I think when you're 17, 18, 19 years old, that's a good time to focus in on liberal arts. Education is not just going to see how I can make a career and earn money. There's more to education than that. And I regret to see that the emphasis has been taken away on the liberal arts.
So, there is, and I think I touched on this, there is a certain economic reality.
Right.
The cost of college being what it is one, even within CUNY. My husband was on the board of the CUNY Board of Trustees in the 70s when it introduced tuition, which, remains, dramatically lower than what it would be in a private institution, but still, for the students that we serve in the city, can be challenging. And so in the minds of the students and their families, the reason that they are going to college is to become employable. That's the reason that they are there. That's the purpose for them. And it is an essential purpose, and it is, often a desperate purpose. And And we can't argue that. What we can do is help them understand the ways in which they can achieve that objective within the framework of what they learn in a liberal arts degree. Now, to give you an example, I was talking to one young man who was at John Jay, and his goal was to become a CSI, like on television, and that involved forensics. And he was grumbling because they were making him take history. And so I said, look, does your teacher make you write papers? And he goes, yeah. And do you have to do research? And he goes, yeah. And do you have to find evidence for your points in these papers? And he goes, yeah. And I said, and there you are. That's forensics. You're getting it in your history course. But nobody had explained it to him. Nobody connected the dots for him. It's why it's important, for us to bring back alumni and to share stories about people who have a wide range of majors and are doing things all over the place. It's why we need to have students understand that career paths linear, right? They're getting less linear by the minute, and that they will use a variety of different skills over a long period of time, and they have no idea of how things will crop up. In my first job at corporate world, when I was in my early 20s, I was at Avon. I'd done political science at Bryn Mawr. It was right after there had been the, short, I guess not a few years after, the equal pay and equal employment opportunity legislation had happened. I was doing this corporate responsibility, and I did an assessment of the company's vulnerabilities relative to this legislation. Excuse me 1 second. So I wrote it in my best legalese that I had learned at Bryn Mawr. And as a result, a bunch of us got raises. Because I had pointed out that there was evidence of wage disparity based on race and gender. So I was applying my political science degree in a workplace context. And we have to be able to help students connect those dots or see the career paths people have had when they have no frame of reference in their own families. We're talking about students who are coming from blue-collar, working-class families who have no idea of what the workplace or pathways look like.
We have one last question. David Bland, please unmute yourself and pose your question.
Thanks. Yeah, that's actually a great segue into what I want to ask about, because I want to ask about a slightly different way to look at this. I want to get your opinion on vocational training. In some countries, particularly Germany, they have extensive vocational education, also combined with apprenticeship programs. And it not only leads to good jobs, but in many ways, more importantly, it leads to enormous emotional satisfaction and sense of worth on the part of the people who do it. I think everybody on this call knows people whose college years have been, in some sense, wasted. That the liberal arts education maybe isn't really for everyone. And I don't say that in a derogatory way, because the alternative to going to a liberal arts college should not be get a job at Walmart. It should be some form of vocational training that leads to a meaningful income and a meaningful life. So I would like to get your thoughts on that.
So I understand that, and my only caution is it can be a slippery slope. You know, do we start tracking certain populations into vocational training from which they will never emerge, and to careers from which they will never be able to advance, right? The original idea of apprenticeship, I think this group is probably of an age to remember either the book or the Disney film Johnny Tremaine, which was about an apprentice who worked for Paul Revere as a silversmith. The assumption, and he would have been indentured, you know, so he's working off the cost of his transport to the United States, as opposed to a slave who was never going to be able to work off their, you know, enslavement. The assumption was that that indentured servant, apprentice, would be able to become a master in that craft, either take over the business or start his own, become a peer. So I think apprenticeship as a point of entry is one thing. If it becomes a ceiling, and given the subtleties of racism, to what extent do you protect against that becoming a ceiling, which to some extent it already has when we only have 8% of Black folks in managerial roles? I just think we have to be careful.
Totally agree with you. Good points, thanks.
And thank you very much. That concludes our Q&A session. So Elaine, I'm going to hand it back to you.
Okay, thank you again so much, Marcia Cantarella, for a most informative talk, and you generated some great discussion. So glad you were able to join us this morning. This talk was actually originally scheduled for March 15th, which was the first in-person session of many that got canceled. So anyway, we're moving forward, which is excellent.